possibly people have seen what has gone through the press with Richard Bertinet, a famous baker from France, living in this country for over 30 years, having a family, living a British wife, British children, and he didn't get full settled status, but only pre-settled status. And I think we cannot overestimate the human cost that the uncertainty over what is being said by this government, and particularly recently, creates to these people. I mean, it's just stressful. It's humanly very stressful. And no wonder that certainly a lot of EU citizens who are living here and working here currently are considering to leave. But what about that sentiment that is created in Europe? And of course, people see what's going on here. How has it actually already affected workforce?
I mean, in terms of our own workforces, we haven't seen major, numbers of EU migrants currently in our workforce leaving the UK. I think that would be true to say. I think it might be different in our supply chain, but I haven't caught up recently with the NFU to know what they would be saying about the kind of availability of workers. But I think there remains a concern. Those workers are really key to the food that we put on the shelves in the UK, and particularly acute in some areas of our businesses. So logistics and distribution being the obvious one. We did a survey of our own members a few years ago, and figures in logistics and distribution particularly high in the South East, East Midlands, West Midlands. So those workers are crucial to our system, and they need the reassurance. Now, we are working with the government to get that reassurance through our companies to their workers, because they're so valuable to their companies, but we're not seeing major departures at the moment.
But in terms of the future workforce that we were talking about?
Absolutely, and the current systems that are being proposed, we've made it clear, do not really sit well with us in terms of the demand for labour that we anticipate we will need going forward. That we don't anticipate the types of worker we are going to require going forward is going to change. We work really hard with UK communities here to try and recruit as many as we can from the local communities to work in our businesses. But again, it's back to a realistic assessment of what actually happens. Those figures are supplemented by great EU migrant workers who come and work in our businesses. So they are, that we are heavily dependent on those for moving food around the country.
So did actually the government discuss with you the labour needs for your industries?
Well, yes, I mean, we have engaged with government, and we obviously took part in various consultations over the last year, 18 months. We have made it clear where our demand for workers really needs to be, and if you look at a future immigration system, how that system works best for us, and some of the proposals that work worse for us, for example, setting a salary threshold that is too high and unrealistic for the type of worker that we would need in our businesses.
But obviously one of the big announcements from the Home Office was over the summer break that free movement would immediately end. Were you made aware of that?
We weren't, no.
That was...
We have a long-standing driver shortage in the logistics and the domestic logistics activity, and our latest survey suggests that 13, 14, maybe 15% of our resident drivers, so just driving around the UK, this isn't international work, just resident drivers are from the rest of the EU. They hold non-UK driving licence issued by another EU member state. So they're absolutely fundamental to us providing, as an industry, the support to not just the food sector, but the retail sector, but all of British commerce, a distribution function. And we have, it's not a question of simply substituting with UK drivers. Those drivers are not available, qualified to the standards necessary to drive a heavy goods vehicle. So our playback to government on this has been you need to revisit urgently your apprenticeship funding arrangements and the criteria for eligibility for funding, because all of a sudden your domestic training needs are fundamentally different to when that apprenticeship levy was designed and introduced. We need far more flexibility in the types of course that are eligible for funding, because if we are going to have to confront these new consequences of the ending of freedom of movement at some time, then we need to start on a process of sourcing the necessary skilled workers within the UK, and we therefore need an apprenticeship levy and training arrangements which actually suits that kind of environment. That's very different to when that scheme was first designed and introduced.
But could you sort of paint a scenario if suddenly on the 31st of October we have no deal? What would that actually look like if really free movement and all the consequences would end that day?
Well, as been described, it could jeopardise the ability of, let's say, a driver from Eastern Europe to decide, as Andrew has described, to come and spend the peak season when there is the demand for drivers is greatest, working in the UK because there's reliable work and his driving or her driving licence remains valid. It's a very much used arrangement. Drivers do move between jobs on contracts, and if all of a sudden there are new checks and controls and requirements to register or seek certain status that wasn't there before, as we've discussed, it may well be far more attractive simply to go and do your work in Germany or France or somewhere where those checks don't require. And on top of the administrative burdens we're talking about, don't forget the actual financial attractiveness of working in the UK has declined quite dramatically, consistent with the fall in the value of the pound. It's simply not worth what it was to come over here and work. So we're fighting those forces in being an attractive employer as well.
And did you get the impression that actually government had thought this through, or was it just something that was announced because there seemed to have been a political opportune moment to say something like that?
No, I don't think there is a deep understanding in government of some of these second and third order consequences of the ending of the freedom of movement, and I think the government is still working its way through some of these consequences, and employers, members, are themselves struggling to come to the terms with exactly what they might have to do in order to give advice to current employees and presumably to encourage them to complete whatever paperwork and registration they need to, because clearly these are very valuable employees and they would like to keep them. So they're working through those consequences as well.
Okay. Thank you.